His hands wouldn't stop trembling. 3 decades after the war, Robert Jameson still couldn't hold a coffee cup steady at breakfast. His wife had grown accustomed to the morning ritual, setting out the special mug with the extra-wide handle, watching him grip it with both palms, the liquid inside rippling with each micro-movement of his damaged nerves. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress engineer, who had once calibrated bomb sights to within 1,000th of an inch precision, now struggled to sign his name on a check. "The tremors are the price," he would say to anyone who asked, though few ever did anymore. The price for 20,000 lives. The doctors had another name for it: peripheral neuropathy from toxic hexavalent chromium exposure. But Robert knew better. These weren't symptoms, they were penance. In the pre-dawn darkness of March 10, 1945, while most Americans were sleeping, Robert had made a decision that saved hundreds of airmen, ended the devastating high-altitude bombing failures over Japan, and ultimately helped burn Tokyo to the ground. The modification he made to the B-29's bombing systems was brilliant, effective, revolutionary, and explicitly forbidden by the United States Army Air Force's most sacred operational protocols. How does a man who saved his comrades but enabled the incineration of a city live with himself? This is the question that followed Robert Jameson for the rest of his life, just as the tremors followed his hands: constant, relentless, impossible to escape. The morning light is filtering through the blinds of a small veterans hospital room in Dayton, Ohio. The year is 1978. Robert Jameson, 76 years old, lies in bed, his gaunt face made even sharper by the harsh fluorescent lighting. A nurse adjusts his IV drip as a young doctor checks his vitals. Robert's hands, those once steady appendages that could disassemble and reassemble a Norden bomb site blindfolded, now twitch constantly against the white hospital sheets. The hexavalent chromium exposure is in its final stages, the doctor says quietly to a medical student, thinking Robert can't hear them. The damage to his peripheral nervous system is irreversible. At this point, we're just making him comfortable. But Robert hears everything. His mind remains as sharp as it was that night over Tokyo when he made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As the medical team leaves, his eyes fix on the ceiling, but what he sees isn't the acoustic tiles above. He sees fire raining from the bellies of 89 B-29 Superfortresses, turning wooden houses into infernos, narrow streets into corridors of flame. He sees what his forbidden modification made possible. "I did it to save our boys," he whispers to no one, but who was going to save them? The journey that led Robert Jameson to that fateful night began years earlier. In 1942, he was a 39-year-old mechanical engineer working for Boeing in Seattle when the Army Air Force recruited him to join a specialized technical unit. His expertise in precision optics and mechanical calibration made him invaluable to America's newest and most ambitious bombing program. By early 1944, he found himself stationed on Tinian Island in the Marianas, helping maintain the complex bombing systems of the newly deployed B-29 Superfortresses. The B-29 was unlike any aircraft that had come before it. With a wingspan of 141 feet and 4 Wright R-3350 engines generating 2,200 horsepower each, it could carry a bomb load of 20,000 pounds over 3,600 miles. Its pressurized cabin allowed crews to operate at altitudes above 30,000 feet, theoretically safe from Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The crowning technological achievement was the remote-controlled defensive gun system and the sophisticated Norden bomb sight, which promised unprecedented bombing accuracy from those extreme altitudes. But theory and reality diverged sharply over Japan. The B-29s encountered something no one had fully anticipated: the jet stream, powerful high-altitude winds that could reach 150 miles per hour. These invisible air currents played havoc with bombing accuracy and pushed fuel consumption beyond safety margins. Worse, the extreme cold at those altitudes caused engines to fail, and the high winds scattered bomb patterns so widely that precision targets were rarely hit. By early 1945, the strategic bombing of Japan was in crisis. General Curtis LeMay, newly appointed commander of the 21 Bomber Command, was facing mounting pressure. The costly B-29 program, nicknamed the billion-dollar gamble, was failing to produce results, and casualty rates were climbing as mechanical failures forced more crews to ditch in the frigid Pacific. Robert Jameson witnessed the toll firsthand. Day after day, B-29s would return to Tinian with engines smoking, fuel gauges on empty, and air crews physically exhausted and mentally shattered from battling the jet stream's turbulence for hours. The precision bombing doctrine that had been drilled into every airman was failing spectacularly, and with each failed mission, more planes and crews were lost, not to enemy action, but to mechanical failure and the merciless Pacific. I was assigned to analyze bomb fall patterns, Robert would later tell investigators. The data showed that less than 5% of our bombs were falling within 1,000 feet of the aiming point. We might as well have been dropping them blindfolded. Then came the order that would change everything. General LeMay, in a radical departure from established doctrine, ordered the B-29s to strip out most of their defensive armament, load up with M69 incendiary bombs, and attack at night from altitudes below 5,000 feet. The strategy was clear. If precision bombing wasn't working, they would burn Japan's cities to the ground. But a critical problem remained. The B-29's entire bombing system, from the Norden bomb site to the release mechanisms, was designed for high-altitude, daylight precision bombing. Using it at low altitude at night was like trying to perform brain surgery with a sledgehammer. The systems simply weren't built for it. This is where Robert Jameson's story truly begins. As one of the senior engineers responsible for the B-29's bombing systems, he was tasked with solving this seemingly impossible problem: how to adapt a precision high-altitude bombing system for low-altitude area attacks in a matter of days, not the months or years such modifications would normally require. They gave me 48 hours, Robert would later recall, his voice hollow. 48 hours to figure out how to turn the most sophisticated bombing platform ever built into something that could carpet a city with fire. What happened next would save hundreds of American airmen, contribute to the devastation of Japanese cities, and haunt Robert Jameson until his dying day. In the cramped maintenance hangar on Tinian, Robert worked through 2 sleepless nights, surrounded by technical manuals, wiring diagrams, and the complex innards of the B-29's bombing system. The official bombing protocols, developed over years of testing and endorsed at the highest levels, explicitly prohibited any field modifications to the Norden bomb site or its integration with the aircraft systems. Unauthorized alterations to bombing systems will result in immediate court-martial, the manual warned in bold red letters. Such modifications could not only compromise accuracy, but potentially cause catastrophic failures, endangering aircraft and crews. Yet Robert saw a solution, a way to bypass the bomb site's complex high-altitude calculations and create a simplified system for the low-altitude night attacks. It would require cutting critical safety interlocks, rewiring release mechanisms, and essentially creating an entirely new bombing system using existing parts in ways their designers never intended. The modification violated every principle of the bombing doctrine we'd been trained to follow, Robert would later testify at the hearing that would end his military career. But following that doctrine was killing our boys. Something had to give. Working with a small team sworn to secrecy, Robert implemented his modifications on 3 B-29s for the upcoming mission. If caught before the mission, he would face a court-martial. If the modifications failed during the mission, dozens of airmen might die. But if they worked... On the night of March 9, 1945, the first wave of modified B-29s took off from Tinian, laden with M69 incendiary bombs, headed for Tokyo. Major Charles W. Sweeney, who would later pilot the atomic mission to Nagasaki, commanded one of the first modified aircraft. The engineering officer told us the modifications were untested but should work, Sweeney would later recall. He said it like a man sending his children into a burning building. "I've never seen someone look so confident and so tortured at the same time." As the B-29s reached the Japanese coast, they descended to 7,000 feet, then 5,000, then lower still, down to altitudes that would have been suicidal in daylight, but offered concealment at night. The modified bombing systems performed perfectly, allowing the incendiaries to be released in tight patterns despite the low altitude and darkness. The result was devastation on a scale never before seen in warfare. Over 16 square miles of Tokyo burned that night. The wooden residential structures, packed tightly together, created a firestorm that generated winds of 70 miles per hour and temperatures reaching 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Canals boiled, metal melted. People trying to escape the flames jumped into rivers where many boiled to death. An estimated 100,000 civilians died in a single night, more than would perish in either the Hiroshima or Nagasaki atomic bombings months later. But American casualties were minimal. Of the 325 B-29s that eventually used Robert's modifications, only 5 were lost, a fraction of the losses suffered in previous high-altitude missions. Word of the mission's success reached Tinian before the aircraft returned. General LeMay immediately ordered all B-29s to be modified using Robert's system. The nighttime firebombing campaign would continue against other Japanese cities, eventually destroying nearly half of the urban area in 67 cities. When the B-29s returned to Tinian after the Tokyo raid, the flight crews were both triumphant and traumatized. They had survived, but what they had witnessed below them was beyond comprehension. "I'll never forget the smell," one navigator told Robert as the engineer inspected the bombing system after the mission. "It came through the oxygen masks, through everything. The smell of a city burning, the smell of people burning." For Robert, this was just the beginning of his burden. His modification had worked perfectly, too perfectly. The bombing accuracy improved by over 700%, allowing the incendiaries to be placed precisely where they would cause the most damage. His engineering brilliance had turned the B-29 from a faltering precision bomber into the most efficient urban destruction machine in history. As the firebombing campaign intensified through the spring and summer of 1945, Robert maintained the modified systems and even made further improvements. Outwardly, he was the model of military efficiency, a problem solver who had helped turn the air campaign against Japan from failure to devastating success. Privately, he was crumbling. "I started having nightmares after the second mission," he would later tell his wife. "Not about the modifications failing, but about them working exactly as designed." Then came the incident that would mark him physically as well as mentally. While working on further modifications to the bombing systems, Robert was exposed to hexavalent chromium, a highly toxic substance used in some of the hydraulic systems. The exposure was severe enough to cause immediate symptoms: nausea, skin lesions, and respiratory problems. But the long-term damage would be to his nervous system, resulting in the tremors that would define the rest of his life. The military doctors treated his immediate symptoms, but missed the chronic exposure that was slowly destroying his peripheral nerves. By the time the war ended in August 1945, Robert's hands had developed a slight but persistent tremor, a physical manifestation of both chemical damage and psychological trauma that would worsen over the decades to come. The tremors were noticeable enough that when investigators from the newly formed Strategic Bombing Survey came to interview technical personnel about the B-29 campaign, one of them asked if Robert was nervous about their questions. "No," he replied, looking down at his shaking hands, "just living with the consequences." The investigation revealed the extent of Robert's unauthorized modifications. Despite their effectiveness, or perhaps because of it, the Army Air Force leadership was divided on how to respond. Some wanted him court-martialed for violating direct orders regarding bombing system modifications. Others, including General LeMay himself, argued that his actions had saved hundreds of American lives and helped bring Japan to the brink of defeat. In the end, a compromise was reached. Robert would receive an honorable discharge for medical reasons, the chromium exposure providing a convenient cover. But there would be no recognition, no medals, no official acknowledgement of his role in creating the bombing system that had proven so devastatingly effective. "You did what you had to do," LeMay reportedly told him in a private meeting before his discharge. "So did I. History can sort out the rest." But history is seldom tidy, and for Robert Jameson, there would be no clear resolution. Returning to civilian life with his wife Margaret in Columbus, Ohio, he tried to rebuild a normal existence. He took a position teaching engineering at Ohio State University, where his brilliance was evident despite his increasingly troublesome tremors. Yet the nightmares continued, and with them came the questions that had no answers. By 1950, with America now engaged in the Korean War, Robert's expertise was once again in demand. The Air Force, facing new challenges with the first generation of jet bombers, reached out to him as a consultant. They wanted his insight on bombing system modifications for the B-27 Stratojet. "I won't work on bombing systems anymore," he wrote back. "My hands aren't steady enough." It wasn't entirely a lie. The tremors had worsened, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Instead, he threw himself into teaching and research on civilian applications of the mechanical principles he had once applied to warfare. His work on hydraulic systems would eventually contribute to improvements in commercial aircraft safety, saving countless lives in the decades to come. It was perhaps a form of atonement. As the years passed, the physical toll of the chromium exposure became more apparent. The tremors spread from his hands to his arms, making even simple tasks challenging. Margaret became his caretaker as well as his wife, helping him button his shirts and cut his food when the trembling became too severe. "You know this isn't your fault," she would tell him, watching him struggle with a fork at dinner. "Isn't it?" he would reply. "My hands built that system. Seems fitting they're the first thing to go." By the late 1960s, as America was embroiled in yet another war in Asia, Robert's health had deteriorated further. The neurological damage from the chromium exposure had progressed to affect his mobility, and he was forced to retire from teaching. Yet his mind remained sharp, perhaps too sharp, filled as it was with memories he couldn't escape. In 1972, as the Vietnam War wound toward its conclusion, Robert received an unexpected visitor. Charles W. Sweeney, now retired from the Air Force, had tracked down the engineer whose modifications had made the Tokyo firebombing mission possible. "I wanted to thank you," Sweeney said, sitting across from Robert in the small living room of the house in Columbus. "Your work saved my life and the lives of my crew. Without those modifications, we might never have made it home." Robert's hands trembled violently as he tried to lift his coffee cup. Sweeney reached out to steady it for him. "But at what cost?" Robert asked. "How many died because I was too clever for my own good?" Sweeney had no answer. Like many who had participated in the strategic bombing campaigns of World War II, he had made his own peace with the moral complexities of their actions. Or perhaps, like Robert, he hadn't made peace at all, but had simply learned to live with the questions. Before leaving, Sweeney handed Robert a small package. Inside was a piece of the bomb sight from his B-29, preserved after all these years. "I kept it to remember what we did," Sweeney said, "both the good and the terrible." After Sweeney's visit, Robert seemed to deteriorate more rapidly. The neurological damage accelerated, and by 1975, he required full-time care. The tremors were now constant, and he had difficulty speaking clearly. Margaret, ever faithful, stayed by his side, but even she couldn't reach him in the dark places his mind increasingly wandered. In the Veterans Hospital in Dayton, where he was admitted in early 1978 as the chromium poisoning began affecting his internal organs, Robert would sometimes become agitated, calling out technical specifications and modification protocols in the middle of the night. The nurses learned to recognize the pattern. He was back on Tinian, working frantically to modify the bombing systems before the mission deadline. "He saved hundreds of airmen," one doctor remarked after reading his heavily redacted military file. "Why does he seem so tormented?" The nurse who had cared for him longest just shook her head. "Because he remembers what happened to everyone else." In his more lucid moments, Robert would sometimes talk about the firebombings to the medical staff, not the technical details, which remained classified even decades later, but the moral weight he carried. "We were so focused on the problem in front of us," he told a young resident physician one evening. "How to make the bombs hit their targets, how to keep our planes in the air,
how to bring our boys home. We solved those problems brilliantly. He looked down at his trembling hands, but we never stopped to ask if we should. By spring 1978, it was clear that Robert had little time left. The hexavalent chromium had damaged his liver beyond repair, and his kidneys were failing. Margaret spent every day at his bedside, reading to him from engineering journals and the books he had loved in healthier days. On a warm afternoon in May, with sunlight streaming through the hospital window, Robert experienced a moment of unusual clarity. His tremors briefly subsided, and he looked at Margaret with full recognition for the first time in weeks. "I need you to know something," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "I've spent my life regretting what I did, but I would do it again. Those boys deserved to come home." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the window. "But so did all those people in Tokyo. That's the truth I could never reconcile." Margaret held his hand as the tremors gradually returned. By evening, he had slipped back into semi-consciousness. 3 days later, Robert Jameson died, the brilliant engineer who had saved hundreds of American airmen and enabled the destruction of Japanese cities, fading away with his contradictions unresolved. His obituary in the Columbus Dispatch made no mention of his war work, describing him only as a respected engineering professor and consultant to the aviation industry. The classified nature of his modifications to the B-29 bombing systems remained secret for years after his death, mentioned only in technical appendices to Air Force bombing doctrine manuals and in the nightmares of those who had witnessed their effects. But the full story of Robert Jameson's contribution to the air war against Japan and the personal price he paid deserves to be told. It is a reminder that behind every technological advance in warfare, there are human beings making decisions, solving problems, and living with the consequences. Sometimes those consequences manifest as medals and honors.
Sometimes they manifest as trembling hands that never stop shaking. In 2006, during a symposium on strategic bombing at the Air Force Historical Research Agency, a retired colonel who had been a young intelligence officer on Tinian in 1945 finally brought Robert's story to light. His paper, titled "The Unauthorized Modification: How a Field Engineer Revolutionized B-29 Bombing Capabilities Over Japan," detailed the technical brilliance and moral complexity of what Robert had accomplished. By making these unauthorized modifications, the colonel concluded, Robert Jameson likely shortened the Pacific War by months and saved thousands of American lives that would have been lost in a land invasion of Japan. But he also enabled one of the most devastating aerial bombing campaigns in history, with all its moral complications.
He carried both of these truths with him for the rest of his life, a burden perhaps too heavy for any one person to bear. The colonel's paper included interviews with surviving B-29 crewmen who had flown the modified aircraft, including a navigator who recalled, "We knew something had changed in the bombing systems. Suddenly, we were hitting everything we aimed at. We didn't question it. We were just grateful to be completing our missions and getting home. None of us knew there was one man whose brilliant solution made it possible, or what it cost him." Perhaps the most poignant testimony came from a maintenance officer who had worked directly with Robert during those critical days on Tinian. He knew exactly what he was doing when he made those modifications. He knew he was violating orders. He knew he might face a court-martial.
But he looked at the loss rates we were suffering, and he made a choice to save the men he could see, the airmen he worked with every day, even if it meant enabling greater destruction for people he couldn't see, the civilians in Japanese cities. I don't know if that choice was right or wrong. I don't think he ever knew either. The symposium paper included a photograph of Robert from 1945, standing beside a B-29 on Tinian. His expression is serious, his posture rigid, the model of military efficiency. There is no hint in the image of the tremors that would later define his life, no suggestion of the moral weight he would carry. He looks like what he was, a problem solver, a technical expert doing his job in the midst of history's largest and most terrible war. Next to this is a second photograph, taken in 1975 at his home in Columbus. His body is thin, his hands visibly shaking, even in the still image. But his eyes are clear and direct, looking at something beyond the camera, perhaps at the past, perhaps at questions that still had no answers.
What lessons should we draw from Robert Jameson's story? Perhaps it is simply this, that the moral clarity we seek in war is often an illusion, that brilliant solutions to tactical problems can create profound ethical dilemmas, that saving some lives may come at the cost of others, and that those who make such choices may pay a price that statistics and history books can never capture, a price measured in trembling hands, sleepless nights, and questions that echo across decades. For Robert Jameson, the forbidden modification that made the B-29 firebombing campaign devastatingly effective was both his greatest professional achievement and his heaviest personal burden. He saved hundreds of American airmen who might otherwise have been lost to the unforgiving physics of high-altitude bombing and the merciless Pacific Ocean. He contributed to the devastation of Japanese cities that ultimately helped end the war without a costly invasion. Both of these truths defined his life. Both followed him from Tinian to Columbus, from 1945 to 1978. Both were written in the tremors that never left his hands. The physical manifestation of damage, both chemical and moral, a constant reminder of what his brilliance had wrought. In the end, perhaps the truest memorial to Robert Jameson is not found in Air Force technical manuals or historical symposia, but in a simple observation from his wife Margaret, who knew him before, during, and after his war service. In a letter to the colonel who finally brought Robert's story to light, she wrote, "My husband saved hundreds of young men with his modifications. He knew that, but he never forgot the cost." His hands shook for 33 years because of the chromium exposure, but I always thought they shook for another reason too, because they had unleashed something he could never fully reconcile with the gentle man I knew. He carried that burden until the day he died. I hope your history books remember not just what he did, but what it did to him, because that's the true cost of war. Not just the immediate casualties, but the weight carried home by those who survive. Robert Jameson's trembling hands are still now, but the questions his story raises about the moral complexity of warfare, the human cost of technological innovation, and the burdens carried by those who make history continue to resonate. In a world where military technology advances at an ever-accelerating pace, his story reminds us to consider not only what we can do, but what it might mean to live with what we've done. The technical details of Robert's modifications remained classified for decades, but engineering analyses conducted in the 1980s revealed the true brilliance of his work. What he accomplished in those 48 sleepless hours on Tinian was nothing short of revolutionary. The B-29's bombing system was built around the Norden bomb site, a complex analog computer that calculated release points based on airspeed, altitude, wind drift, and other factors. It was designed exclusively for high-altitude precision bombing, with safety interlocks that prevented operation below 15,000 feet. Robert's challenge wasn't just technical, but conceptual, repurposing a precision instrument for an entirely different mission profile. The genius was in the simplicity, noted Air Force Technical Sergeant James Whitaker, who later studied the modifications for the Air Force Museum. He bypassed the altitude restrictions by creating a secondary circuit that told the bomb site it was operating at 20,000 feet when it was actually at 5,000. Then he recalibrated the release mechanisms to account for the much shorter bomb fall time. But the most controversial aspect was his modification to the bomb release sequencing. The original design incorporated mandatory spacing between releases to prevent bomb collisions in the air. Robert removed these safety features, allowing for much tighter bomb patterns, ideal for creating the firestorm conditions that devastated Tokyo and other cities. He essentially hot-wired the most sophisticated bombing system ever built, Whitaker explained. It was like taking a precision surgical instrument and turning it into a flamethrower. Brilliant, but horrifying in its implications. When investigators asked Robert why he hadn't sought official approval for his modifications, his answer was simple: there wasn't time, and they would have said no. The urgency of the war situation and the mounting losses of aircraft and crews had created what ethicists would later call a moral crucible, a situation where following the rules seemed more destructive than breaking them. For the air crews who flew the modified B-29s, the results were immediately apparent. Captain Marcus Davidson, a pilot with the 73rd Bomb Wing, recalled, "Suddenly, everything worked. The bombs went exactly where we aimed them. After months of frustration and watching our friends disappear into the Pacific, we could finally do our job and get home alive." We didn't know some engineer had broken every rule in the book to make it happen, but I'm alive today because he did. Many of the B-29 crews who benefited from Robert's modifications never knew his name. They returned home, started families, built careers, and lived the lives that might have been cut short without his intervention. Some suffered their own traumas from what they had witnessed over the burning cities of Japan. Others found ways to compartmentalize those experiences, separating the moral complexities of their wartime service from their civilian lives. Technical Sergeant William Lawrence, a B-29 gunner who flew 15 missions with the modified bombing system, encountered Robert by chance at a veterans event in 1962. When he learned who Robert was, he embraced the engineer with tears in his eyes. "I have 4 children and 6 grandchildren because of you," he said. "None of them would exist if you hadn't figured out how to make those bombing runs work." Robert's hands trembled as he returned the embrace, and later that night he told Margaret, "How do you measure a life? The ones saved against the ones lost? The ones that never happened against the ones that did? There's no equation for that." His story has become particularly relevant in our modern era of increasingly autonomous weapons systems. What obligations do engineers, scientists, and technical experts have when they create technologies with the potential for both salvation and destruction? When does the imperative to protect one's comrades outweigh broader humanitarian concerns? What price is too high to pay for innovation in warfare? In military ethics courses at West Point and the Air Force Academy, Robert's story has become a case study for future officers grappling with the moral dimensions of their profession. His predicament has no easy answers, no clear-cut moral lessons, only the sobering recognition that, in war, technical brilliance alone is not enough. Innovation without ethical consideration can lead to both triumph and tragedy, often simultaneously. One Air Force historian noted, "Robert Jameson's story forces us to confront the reality that the most consequential moral decisions in warfare are often made not by generals in command centers, but by technical experts solving practical problems under extreme pressure. These individuals rarely see themselves as making grand strategic or ethical choices, yet their solutions can shift the course of conflict and history." In parallel to the military recognition of Robert's story, civil engineering societies have incorporated his case into discussions about professional ethics and responsibility. The question of whether technical experts should be accountable for the applications of their innovations, even when those applications extend beyond their direct control, remains a subject of intense debate. Some argue that technical innovation should be separated from its military applications. Others contend that engineers must consider the full spectrum of consequences their work might enable. Perhaps most striking is how Robert's story resonates with modern debates about artificial intelligence and autonomous weapons systems. Just as Robert found himself creating a system with capabilities and consequences he couldn't fully anticipate, today's engineers and computer scientists face similar dilemmas with AI-driven warfare technologies. The line between innovation that protects one's forces and innovation that enables unprecedented destruction has only grown thinner and less distinct. A professor of engineering ethics at MIT observed, "What makes Jameson's case so compelling for students is that he wasn't trying to create a weapon of mass destruction. He was trying to solve a specific technical problem to save American lives. Yet the solution he found had devastating consequences that went far beyond what he could have anticipated." That's the risk every technical innovator in defense faces: the possibility that elegant solutions may lead to unintended and terrible outcomes. In retrospect, it's clear that Robert Jameson's story transcends the technical details of the B-29 modifications themselves. It captures a universal dilemma faced by those who apply their talents during wartime. His experience represents the unspoken burden carried by countless others who found themselves making consequential decisions under extreme pressure. Decisions that saved lives they could see, while taking lives they could not.
The coffee cup with the extra-wide handle, now displayed in the Air Force Museum, stands as a quiet reminder that the costs of war extend far beyond the battlefield and echo through decades in ways that aren't always visible but are no less real. In 2015, a small plaque was installed at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, not far from where Robert spent his final days. It acknowledges his contribution to the B-29 bombing campaign without glorifying or condemning it, simply presenting the historical facts and their context. The last line reads, "The modifications made by Robert Jameson and his team saved countless American airmen and contributed to the strategic bombing campaign that helped end World War II."
Their story reminds us that behind every technological achievement in warfare are human beings making difficult choices in impossible circumstances, choices they may carry with them long after the conflict ends. Next to the plaque is a display case containing a single item, a coffee cup with an extra-wide handle, donated by Margaret Jamison before her own death in 2008. The cup that held morning coffee and trembling hands for over 3 decades now holds a different kind of memory, of brilliance and burden, of problems solved and questions unanswered, of an engineer who saved his comrades and never fully saved himself. If you reached this far, you truly understand why remembering matters. Share your important thoughts below and help keep these powerful, forgotten stories alive for future generations.